Okay, last week we were looking at Chapter 7 of Siegel's Introduction to the Work of Melanie Klein, that chapter on manic defenses. Manic defenses, in my view, can be directed against both paranoid schizoid anxieties and depressive anxieties. We talked about the manic triad, triumph and control and contempt. In that connection, I wanted to draw attention to Ron Britton's list of 3 strategies. This is in his book Sex, Death, and the Superego, and in my book, The Still Small Voice, I expanded his list of strategies. I added another 5, so we have 8 strategies for dealing with the object related to the manic triad. Britton points out that the schizoid withdraws from the object into a fortress. The borderline colonizes the object. There's control. The hysteric impersonates the object. And then I add the following 5. So the 4th would be that the psychotic denies the object, denies the reality of the object, of a separate object. 5, the pervert castrates the object. The 6th strategy, the psychopath destroys the object. 7th, the neurotic acknowledges dependence and guilt towards the object, dependency and guilt. And suffers from the conflicts of ambivalence. The healthy person repairs, loves, depends on, and sacrifices for the good object, but also is prepared to hate and to fight against the bad object. Okay. Different strategies for dealing with the reality and the threat constituted by the existence of a separate object. Okay, back to Siegel. She sees the manic defenses against protecting against depression, and I, of course, argue that in addition to threatening against paranoid schizoid depression, they operate against the depressive anxiety of the depressive position precisely by regressing into PS and employing, once again, splitting omnipotence and devaluation. She gives an example of a patient's use of manic defenses in the face of what she calls depression threatened by the impending analytic vacation. I really think her illustration concerns defenses against sadness, pining, separation, and guilt rather than against depression. I've indicated that I think manic defenses really represent a regression to the use of omnipotence, characteristic of PS. Unlike depressive position mechanisms like reaction formation or reversal that one sees in D, these are neurotic defenses. A person striving to be a bit up instead of being down, trying to be confident instead of anxious. I think these are the neurotic analogs of paranoid schizoid manic defenses. I don't really see them as manic defenses, but as neurotic analogs. Recall that Freud in Totem and Taboo talked about the primal crime in which the brothers rose up and slew the father. And this was followed by a primal feast. Siegel calls this the Manic feast. Mardi Gras precedes the 40 days of Lent, and fasting follows the cannibalistic feast. The object is devoured and identified with in the cannibalistic feast, so there's no loss or guilt. Elation instead of loss and guilt and mourning. Okay, turning now to Chapter 8, which concerns reparation, the wish to restore and recreate the destroyed good object, both externally and internally. The point is that developing confidence in our reparative powers enables us to live out loud. I forget the name of the artist who uses that phrase, live out loud, rather than having to walk on eggs out of fear of breaking things and being unable to fix them. When we have confidence that we can repair, we can fix what's broken, then we are freer to express ourselves, to live out loud. If someone gets hurt, I can apologize. As a result, I have less inhibition. Reparation for Siegel, of course, and for Klein, is the basis of creativity, as we've seen. Creativity being rooted in the wish to restore and recreate the lost objects and the lost states of happiness. So, reparative fantasies and activities are capable of resolving the anxieties of the depressive position. Loss can be followed by recovery. The object survives and reappears. We talked about the move into the depressive position and the lessening of omnipotence of the self, and also discovery of the resilience of the object. Less fear of destroying it. All of which reminds me of my rather dismal high school football career. I was a defensive linebacker, and I could spot the ball carrier and cross the scrimmage line and be on him, but he would then drag me for 10 yards, which defeats the whole purpose. And my coach would be screaming, "Carveth, hit him!" But I could not launch my body into the air and knock his legs out from under him, because I guess I had some omnipotent fantasy of my destructiveness, even though he might have been larger than me and he was wearing a helmet and pads and so on. But my omnipotence was such, I did not believe enough in his resilience to be able to really let go. So I spent a lot of time warming the bench. Okay. By growing confidence in my capacity to keep and restore my good objects and my good self, confidence in my capacity to heal myself allows me to bear deprivation without excessive hate. My hate is less frightening to me because of confidence that my love can restore what hatred has destroyed. Mourning. The loss and the restoration through mourning of the good internal object enriches the ego and lessens the need for omnipotent control, lessens the need for those 8 strategies that I mentioned. Okay. Turning now to manic or magical reparation as opposed to healthy reparation. It's a paranoid schizoid phenomenon. It's characterized by omnipotence. So, for example, a man strikes his wife and later he brings her flowers as if the flowers, I mean, she's bruised. The flowers are supposed to somehow magically heal her. This is not true reparation. True reparation would be telling her to take the kids and go and stay with her mother because it's not safe for her to be around him, and he enters an anger management program. I mean, that would be a true reparative type of action. Manic reparation is really an avoidance of recognizing the real pain and the real damage done and taking appropriate action. True reparation is not a defense. True reparation acknowledges the damage done and seeks to repair it. Manic reparation is a defense. Its aim is to repair in such a way that guilt and loss are never experienced. So, manic reparation is done without acknowledgement of guilt. There's no real acknowledgement of damage done. And also the object is felt as inferior, dependent, and at depth contemptible. This is in contrast to true love or concern, which if felt would threaten true depressive anxiety, grief, and loss. So once again, on my website, there's an interview in which I'm asked about David Hare's play Skylight, in which instead of being able to repair his relationship with his wife Alice, who is dying of cancer, he builds her a big home with a skylight and so on, but he really then can't face her. He can't really experience any genuine guilt. He can't carry out any real reparation. Even after she dies, he can't really experience any real grief and mourning. Kira, the young woman that he was having the affair with, she expiates through self-deprivation, but she also is evading genuine guilt. I think in her we see a kind of mixture of real and manic reparation. Guilt is not relieved. Unconscious guilt is not relieved by manic reparation. The objects being magically repaired in manic reparation are unconsciously and sometimes even consciously treated with contempt and felt as ungrateful and even unconsciously dreaded as persecutors. So Kira is attempting to expiate through work with these deprived lower class kids that she's teaching, but her language betrays this kind of contempt. She refers to them as the dregs of society, and she refers to people like her, social workers, teachers who work with such people, as cleaning out the drains of society. So this reminds us of the Lady Bountiful type of charitable worker who spends on unworthy people felt to be bad and dangerous. So this is reparation by magic, and magical reparation involves the denial of guilt and loss. Instead of the slow process of genuine reparation, it's something that the person wants to have done with quickly. Siegel gives an example of a child who is in manic reparation, and she engages in an attack on words, blah, 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 because words separate. Words present us with separateness, and this, of course, leads to recognition of the separate object and one's guilt, and requires mourning. But instead of all of this in manic reparation, we want instant repair. While, like those patients who want an instant cure through swallowing pills of one sort or another, instead of facing the long, slow, and painful process of a genuinely analytic cure, which is very analogous to the process of mourning. Siegel talks about the manic strategy of going to sleep in order to not see. Sleep as a distraction from recognition of reality, which reminds me of the early Sartre's sketch for a theory of the emotions, in which he describes emotion as magic. He gives the example of fainting, so as not to see reality or to make reality go away, so one faints. Or one has an emotional tantrum as a kind of magical way of dealing with a frustrating problem. Okay. Tom brought roses. He had initially courted his wife by sending her roses. He now brings roses for his dying wife. No true reparation, the evasion of guilt and loss. In reality, in health, the depressive position is never fully worked through. We have a lifelong battle with our aggression. It must go on all the time. It's a battle that is never magically won once and for all. I think some degree of magical reparation is at work in the minds of those analysts who think they've had one good analysis and they're done. And they take offense at the idea that they might need to go back into analysis, or even back into supervision after they've graduated. This is a manic idea. Freud himself said that the analyst should maybe go back into analysis every 5 years. Some of us do that, but some analysts take offense at the idea that they should. That's kind of magical idea, that you've had one analysis and therefore you're done. The analyst helps through naming. Again, the importance of putting everything into words. And this seems central to true reparation, the renunciation of omnipotence and magic, the acceptance of separateness. This allows one's object to be free, and to love and restore one's object and accept the separateness of the object makes it possible for one to couple and to bear the primal scene. Because if my object is separate and I perceive that he or she can have relations with other objects, that triangulation, being able to face this means that I can bear the pain of the primal scene instead of having to attack the couple. Okay, so this leads us to Chapter 9, Early Stages of the Oedipus Complex. As we move into D, we move into triangulation. Separate individuals have relationships with one another. I perceive the link between father and mother. I either learn how to bear this triangle and the primal scene, the reality of the coupling of the others, or I regress into the paranoid schizoid position and attack links. Siegel refers to the child's fantasy of uninterrupted intercourse between the parents, in which they give each other all gratifications, oral, anal, urethral, genital, and the child can feel then acutely deprived, intensely jealous, and intense envy in the face of this fantasy of uninterrupted gratification going on between the parents. And in the face of this pain, there can be regression into the paranoid schizoid position and aggressive attacks on the couple. So we have the fantasy of the combined parents, father and mother merged, and there can be envious attacks and projections onto this figure, persecutory figure of the combined parents. In Ridley Scott's film Alien, again, we see this. There's a male android linked to the computer called Mother. So Mother and this male are linked, combined, allied persecutors who are attacked by the astronauts. Perception of the actual relationship between the separate parents and their intercourse can be defended against by regression to these images of the merged couple. The parents in hated intercourse become a hateful, threatening monster. We see this in horror films of various types. These monsters locked in battle become almost one. The parents in intercourse produce babies, and this leads to jealousy and envy. So the parents are combined into one monstrous figure into which oral aggression and rage is projected. She gives an example from a patient where there are these enormous teeth, drawing attention to the oral element of this. working through the depressive position enables one to preserve and defend and repair the link between the parents instead of attacking it. And being able to tolerate the jealousy and the envy enables one gradually to be able to sublimate these feelings and then to move into a position where one finds someone like the desired parent, to let go of the literal incestuous desire and to sublimate it and to find someone like the beloved parent. Sublimation, as we've seen, is motivated by conflict and by love of the parents. And it's the love for the parents that permits one to allow their coupling. And by allowing their coupling, one becomes free to couple oneself. But if one can't bear the primal scene, if one can't bear the coupling of the parents, one is going to have trouble tolerating coupling oneself. And of course, for Bion, all thinking is a kind of coupling. So one isn't going to be able to think properly if one can't bear the primal scene and begin to sublimate it. Just a comment on the paper by Harold Searles, Oedipal Love in the Countertransference. Like the Kleinians, Searles, and unlike Freud, who sees the Oedipus complex as shattered under the threat of castration. I mean, it's castration anxiety that for Freud leads us to surrender the incestuous wish towards one parent and the aggression towards the rival parents. All of this is shattered by the fear of castration. Searles, like the Kleinians, say, well, that may well describe a neurotic situation, but the healthy resolution of the Oedipus complex is not something that's brought about primarily by castration fear. It's brought about by love of the parents and a kind of loving respect for their relationship and the sublimation that can then follow from that. Okay, in chapter 10, called A Postscript on Technique, Siegel refers to Anna Freud's view that the small child's ego is too immature and the child's superego too weak, too undeveloped to be able to establish a truly psychoanalytic process. And therefore, for Anna Freud, the analyst must first educate and support ego development and strengthen the superego so that analysis would eventually become possible. Of course, for Klein, the situation is very different because the child's superego is far harsher. The early superego is extremely harsh, and the analyst's interpretive activity decreases its severity through interpretation. And this decrease in superego severity through interpretation frees the ego to develop more freely. So there's a real difference of opinion here. For the Kleinians, there is sufficient ego in any child who can speak to be able to establish an analytic process, and even with the non-speaking psychotic child, an analytic process can sometimes be evolved precisely by interpreting this harsh, primitive, early superego, which is an identification with the all-bad persecutory object. So the Kleinians adhere to the basic psychoanalytic method and frame. Siegel points out that it's essential for the analyst to not act out what the patient is projecting, because that would simply confirm the patient's omnipotent control of the analyst. Instead, the goal is to be able to contain, to be able to accept and understand what's going on, and to interpret what's going on. So the analyst interprets what's projected into him, and then he studies the effect of the interpretation on further material that the patient brings. And so we have a to and fro kind of interchange in the here and now. All of this is contained and transference from both the past and from what's currently going on between the patient and the analyst. These references are contained in all the material that the patient brings. The analyst does not push back into the patient what the patient has projectively identified into the analyst. Instead, it is contained and eventually interpreted. So there's the debate as to, what cures in analysis. Is it insight, or is it a corrective relationship? Siegel says it's both, because to start with the relationship, it's only in and through the relationship with an analyst who does not simply project or react, but who understands, that true insight can develop. Insight can only develop through the relationship with an analyst who can contain and process, understand and interpret. On the other hand, it's only through insight that a better relationship with the analyst can be formed. It's only through insight into psychic reality and all of the distortions and fantasies that are distorting the relationship that one can get free of the distortions and begin to develop and to perceive the reality of one's relationship with a good object. So that in order for the relationship to be healing, there has to be insight into the distortions. So I think this is really an important point, that the relationship can only heal once insight has been established. And further insight can only develop within the relationship. So this is not an either-or, relationship versus insight. Both elements are involved. Okay, at this point I want to turn to discussion of an article by my colleague Alex Tarnopolsky, published in Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy in 1995, called Understanding Countertransference. He begins by distinguishing, while discussing the issue of the two concepts of countertransference. One is an undesirable result of the therapist's conflicts, and the other is countertransference as a response to the patient's communications. And I think that it's helpful to use Freud's idea here of the complemental series that he used to describe the debate between heredity and environment, or nature and nurture. These are the two poles of a continuum, and sometimes it would be 20% heredity and 80% environment. Other times it might be 10% environment and 90% heredity. So let's apply that idea here. And at one end, and this is essentially what Winnicott does with countertransference, at one end there is the mainly subjective countertransference, that is the countertransference that comes from my own neurosis, my own unresolved neurotic issues. And at the other end, there is the countertransference that is coming from the patient. Winnicott doesn't distinguish between two aspects of that second kind of countertransference that's coming from the patient. I distinguish the induced countertransference, the countertransference I'm having that's being induced in me through the patient's use of projective identification, as opposed to what Winnicott himself calls the objective countertransference, which is the kind of feeling that anyone would have in relation to this person, the kind of feeling that this patient creates in anyone. I think we need to distinguish between those two different forms of the objective countertransference as opposed to the subjective countertransference, which is coming from my unresolved neurotic conflicts. Now, of course, in reality, any countertransference is going to involve elements of both. That's the complemental series. Sometimes it's going to be 80% my unresolved issues that are contaminating my work with my patient. In other words, I'm engaged in transference. I'm confusing my patient with my mother, my father, my sister. And I need analysis to resolve my neurotic transferences towards my patient. But at other times, it's going to be minimally my neurotic issues, and it's going to be mostly coming from the patient in terms of what's being induced. But there will always be some element of my subjectivity involved, because for the patient to induce something in me, they have to find a hook. They have to find a hook in my subjectivity so that they can carry out the projective identification. So part of our work as analysts is a problem of discernment, how to discern how much is my neurosis, how much is really a reaction to or an induction by the patient. Tarnopolsky talks about the two poles, extreme detachment on the one hand and over-involvement on the other, and of course we're striving for some kind of middle position here where we're not excessively detached but also not over-evolved. That would be the dialectical struggle. We try to maintain what he calls a benevolent neutrality. Benevolent neutrality, not cold, indifferent, aloof, but benevolent neutrality. A peculiar non-judgmental acceptance. Peculiar non-judgmental acceptance. Avoiding the extremes of indifference or over-involvement. He distinguishes the classical narrow sense of countertransference as the doctor's neurotic reactions, as opposed to the wider concept of countertransference, all of the analyst's emotions and behaviors in response to the patient. Okay, we've already talked about that. Okay, he goes on to discuss three countertransference positions. This is the core of his paper. The three are 1, empathy, 2, complementarity, and 3, enactment. Begins with empathy. He gives the example of the family doctor who encounters the patient who is anxious and feeling overburdened, and it turns out he is facing his examinations, and the doctor empathizes He has a certain feeling of togetherness with the patient. He remembers his own examination anxieties. There's a feeling of mutuality, but there's also still a sense of separateness between patient and doctor. In other words, the doctor feels his boundaries are respected. These are two individuals. Doctor feels free to think. Heinrich Racker describes this countertransference position as based on a concordant identification of the analyst with the patient's self-state, and in my paper on concordant and complementary countertransference, a clarification published in the Canadian Journal a few years ago, I identify what I call Racker's error. And Tarnopolsky is picking up on Racker's error here. He's not explicitly calling it such, but he's indicating his difference with Racker on this very issue. Because Racker identifies identification with the patient's self-state as concordant and as empathy. He calls that empathic. And sometimes that can be empathic when it's conscious. I argue that when it's unconscious, it disturbs empathy. Just as the unconscious complementary countertransference disturbs empathy and can, in fact, enhance empathy when it's conscious. So we have this difference with Racker that's beginning to show up here. When Tarnopolsky talks about complementarity, he gives the example of the doctor who, instead of comfortably being able to identify with the overburdened, anxious patient, but preserve his sense of separate self, the doctor now is being progressively overwhelmed, exhausted, impoverished, and defeated because the patient is giving the doctor a taste of that overburdened feeling of being overwhelmed that he has. He is inducing his emotional state in the analyst through projective identification. The analyst now feels immersed in the patient's inner world. This is the complementary countertransference, based on a complementary identification with the patient's state of being overwhelmed. But here Tarnopolsky says, but I do not follow strictly Racker's definition here. And that's exactly correct, because both the concordant and the complementary countertransference may be conscious and empathic, or unconscious, and therefore not empathic. In other words, what the patient projects may be his object, but it may also be his self, and Tarnopolsky is aware of this. The therapist, as identified with a child, projected by the patient, a child who was witnessing a particularly cruel intercourse. So here Tarnopolsky is drawing attention to the fact that the patient not only induces his objects in the analyst, but induces painful self-states in the analyst. There are no rules, he says, about which is projected. The therapist might also have been invaded by the projection of the cruel and excited part, or by a crazy idea. The patient is therefore not always necessarily in the position of a child vis-a-vis the parent therapist. In this example, it's the other way around. Sometimes the self is projected, sometimes the object is projected. So complementary for Racker means projection of the object, but complementary for Tarnopolsky can refer to either the projection of the object or of the self, whichever that the patient is projecting. This is contra Racker. Finally, in addition to empathy and complementarity being that which the patient is projecting, self or object, there is enactment. Here, in enactment, instead of interpreting the patient's pathology, the analyst ends up impersonating it and enacting precisely what the patient suffers from. He is enacting a part of the patient, a part that the patient has delivered to him. Grinberg calls this counter-identification. I think it's an unnecessary term. The patient is projectively identifying something into the analyst, and the analyst is introjecting and identifying with it and beginning to enact it. This can reach such extremes that the analyst really becomes hypnotized, essentially, by the patient, and the analyst becomes the puppet. And it's as if the patient is the puppeteer, or the ventriloquist. The analyst begins to engage in enactments, sometimes acting on the part of the patient, writing letters for the patient, going into court for the patient, becoming the patient's advocate in various ways. So the analyst has lost all neutrality, is believing in the patient's fantasies, has converted to the patient's worldview. The analyst has joined a cult. That's extreme. Introjective, I should say, introjective identification with what the patient is projecting, and then, far from containing it and interpreting it, acting it out. Tarnopolsky indicates usefully that part of our countertransference, subjective countertransference, doesn't just come from our own personal neurosis. It also comes from our theoretical models, our favorite theoretical models, and our vital experiences and perspectives, our emotional dispositions, and so on. Okay. I think we've covered the basic ideas here. I'd like to give a couple of examples. The first is that of a patient that I worked with who had an older brother who was very talented. So my patient would practice for weeks for the upcoming track meet. The brother wouldn't train at all, but on the day of the event would show up and win all the ribbons. Or my patient would struggle to learn how to play the trumpet, and one day the brother would see it lying there and would pick it up, and in a few minutes he'd be playing wonderfully. And there was a great deal of envy and hate towards this older brother, and I was well aware from the beginning that if I behaved in a way to become identified with this older brother, the analysis was going to be in trouble. And I was so on guard against being this domineering older brother that I completely lost sight of the fact that the patient had projectively identified into me the intimidated younger brother. The patient was intimidating me. I was unconscious of this. I was so busy trying to avoid being the patient's object, the brother, that I became blind to the fact that he was the domineering brother and I was intimidated him. Okay, here's a wonderful example of projective identification offered by the British Kleinian Betty Joseph in 1985 in a paper called Transference, the Total Situation. This is contained in her book, chapter 11 of her book, Psychic Equilibrium and Psychic Change. This is a seminar of psychoanalysts, and one analyst is presenting a case to the seminar, and it's a patient, the case of a patient that the analyst is having great difficulty understanding this patient. And as she presents the material, everyone in the seminar is doing their best to understand the patient's material. And they're looking at it from this point of view and that point of view, raising this idea and that idea, this theory and that theory. And none of this is seeming to really resolve the confusion, the lack of understanding. When finally they get the point, that it is not understanding that is the point. Not understanding is the point. The patient is projecting not understanding into the analyst, and the analyst is projecting this not understanding into the group, and both the analyst and the group are in danger of avoiding what's being projected, avoiding understanding what's being projected, which is understanding that it is not understanding that is being projected. They're in danger of avoiding this through not understanding it, but reaching out for and accepting a false or pseudo understanding, forcing this theory or that theory, which would really result in psychobabble, cliches, which would give the feeling that we understand, but it's a false feeling, and in any case, it avoids precisely what needs to be understood, namely, the patient's feeling of not understanding and not being understood. The patient can't understand because the patient's mother couldn't understand her. Patient is projecting this into the analyst. She's making the analyst into a mother who can't understand her. So this is a mother transference. It's the transference or projection. It's the projection of the mother who can't understand. And because the mother can't contain and can't understand, the patient is confused. And so it's both the not understanding mother and the resulting confused child that is being projected into the analyst. She doesn't understand and she's confused now, just as the patient's mother couldn't understand, and just as the patient is confused. Neither the mother nor the analyst nor the group can contain this patient. The patient remains uncontained. This object relation is being enacted but not understood. It's being repeated but not remembered or put into words. And there's a danger that it will be repeated through false containment, substituting for real containment. Okay, this is a wonderful example of projective identification and of the need to be able to tolerate these states, in this case a state of confusion and not understanding, to be able to tolerate it, that is to contain it, long enough to be able to understand that this is exactly what's being induced, and this is exactly what needs to be contained and understood and interpreted. Okay,